In the spring of 1961, activists from the Congress on Racial Equality (CORE) organized a trip to challenge segregation laws throughout the South using nonviolent civil disobedience. As these Freedom Riders traveled from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, they faced harassment and brutal assaults from Southern white supremacists. The courage that these civil rights leaders showed sparked further peaceful protests and caused the federal government to ultimately offer them protection. The Freedom Riders left a legacy of activism that compelled the Interstate Commerce Commission to desegregate seating on all buses, carving a path to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation throughout the country.
Hallelujah, I'm a traveling down freedom's main line.
Soon after the Civil War ended, white Southerners had begun to pass legislation that restricted the rights of African Americans. Known as Jim Crow laws, in every Southern state they mandated segregation in public places, meaning that blacks were forced to drink from different fountains, use different restrooms, attend different schools, and sit in different sections of buses, trains, and their stations. First passed in the 1860s and 1870s, these laws were still being enforced in the mid-20th century. In 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Morgan v. Virginia that racial segregation of interstate travel was illegal, as it violated the Interstate Commerce Act. Later, on December 5, 1960, the Supreme Court ruled in Boynton v. Virginia that segregation of interstate travel waiting rooms, such as bus and train stations, was also unconstitutional. The Southern states ignored both of these Supreme Court rulings and continued to segregate travel on buses and trains. Civil rights organizations had been leading the fight against Jim Crow laws throughout the 20th century. In 1942, a group of interracial students from Chicago founded CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, as a civil rights organization dedicated to nonviolent direct action. In 1947, CORE organized a project called the Journey of Reconciliation. It recruited blacks and whites to travel on buses throughout the Upper South, confronting racial segregation and challenging the Southern states to abide by the Supreme Court ruling of Morgan v. Virginia. Although this trip did not change segregation in the Deep South, it inspired CORE and provided a template for how to protest segregation peacefully. In late 1960, James Farmer, the executive director of CORE, began organizing a freedom ride that would resurrect the Journey of Reconciliation and test the Boynton Supreme Court ruling. This time, CORE planned its ride to protest segregation in the Deep South, where Jim Crow laws remained most entrenched. Farmer recruited 12 other civil rights leaders from CORE, some white and some black, to ride in Greyhound and Trailway buses from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Farmer knew they would experience violence on their trip and trained the riders to resist any of the violence they would encounter. The first Freedom Riders left Washington, D.C. on May 4, 1961. Initially, they were surprised by the lack of hostility they faced traveling through Virginia and North Carolina. The first violence they experienced came in Rock Hill, South Carolina, where John Lewis was assaulted and beaten outside a white waiting room. When fellow riders tried to intervene, they too were brutally attacked. Leaving Atlanta on two separate buses, the riders faced additional violence. Just outside of Anniston, Alabama, the first bus was firebombed by a white mob, and riders were viciously assaulted as they fled the burning bus. Members of the Ku Klux Klan had boarded the second bus and began to attack the Freedom Riders at the Anniston Trailways terminal. The second bus arrived in Birmingham on the morning of May 14th to find a larger mob of white supremacists waiting at the bus terminal. The Birmingham police chief, Bull Connor, had earlier agreed to wait 15 minutes before arriving to intervene in the violence. During those minutes, the enraged whites stomped and pummeled the Freedom Riders, knocking some unconscious. Though the police were not present, a national reporter for CBS News witnessed part of the onslaught.
They knocked one man, a white man, down at my feet, and they beat him and kicked him until his face was a bloody red pulp. The police did not arrive at the scene until 10 minutes late, when these men had, as if on signal, dispersed and had gone further down the street, where I saw some of them discussing their achievement of the day right under the windows of the police commissioner's office.
The next morning, Hundreds of newspapers across the country ran front-page articles about the bloodshed in Anniston and Birmingham. The Freedom Riders, though beaten and battered, wanted to continue by bus to Montgomery. However, the governor of Alabama, John Patterson, announced, quote, "The citizens of the state are so enraged that I cannot guarantee protection for this bunch of rabble-rousers." Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent a representative to escort the riders by airplane to their final destination of New Orleans. Though this group of activists had completed the first ride, there would be many more to come. Less than a week later, on May 20th, 21 Freedom Riders boarded a Greyhound bus in Nashville, bound for Montgomery, Alabama. The reception they encountered in that city was brutal. A mob of over 300 extremists savagely attacked the riders, as well as a federal agent at the Montgomery bus terminal, leaving many of them stranded without medical attention for hours. Media coverage of the extreme violence and the indifference of white police and local officials caused a public outrage. The federal government was compelled to respond. Robert Kennedy sent 400 U.S. Marshals to Alabama and arranged for a federal court injunction to prohibit the Klan from interfering with interstate travel. This federal protection bolstered the Freedom Riders movement and encouraged more activists to join the movement and continue the rides into the state of Mississippi. Beginning on May 24th and continuing into late July, busloads of Freedom Riders undertook the trip to Jackson, Mississippi. As soon as each group arrived, the riders were immediately arrested for disturbing the peace.
June 10th, we got on the bus for Jackson and arrived at about 6:30 in the morning in the bus depot in Jackson to an almost unoccupied waiting room. And there was one woman behind the counter, and then the room was filled with police. We walked in, 6 of us, and we were arrested for disturbing the peace, which I find really funny because there was nobody there but us.
Mississippi officials wanted to intimidate the riders through arrest. In Mississippi, they were sent from Jackson City Jail to Hinds County Jail and finally to Parchman State Penitentiary, a maximum security facility.
And they thought they would scare people, and then they wouldn't come because they would be scared that they'd be arrested and put in the state penitentiary. It had no effect. People kept coming and coming and coming and getting arrested and getting arrested.
By the end of the summer, over 400 activists had participated in the Freedom Rides of 1961, young and old, ranging in age from 13 to 61, black and white, male and female, from the South and from the North, college students, ministers, civil rights workers, and union activists. The Freedom Riders were an incredibly diverse group. Motivated by a desire for racial equality, the courage that these civil rights leaders showed had both short-term and long-term legacies. One of the immediate effects of the Freedom Riders came on September 22nd, when the Interstate Commerce Commission, a federal government agency, declared an end to segregation of interstate bus travel. The determination and success of the Freedom Riders encouraged others in the civil rights movement to keep pushing for further desegregation. In August of 1963, over 250,000 civil rights activists traveled to Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington, the largest peaceful protest at that point in American history. They were there to encourage Congress to pass a comprehensive civil rights bill. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act the following year in 1964. This landmark piece of federal legislation banned all forms of racial segregation throughout the country. The long-term legacy of the Freedom Riders is perhaps even more significant. As one historian stated, the Freedom Riders, quote, foreshadowed the grassroots rights revolution that would transform American citizenship over the next 4 decades. The rising movement for women's rights, military withdrawal from Southeast Asia, environmental reform, gay and lesbian rights, and the rights of the disabled, all built upon the foundation of legitimacy and success established by Freedom Riders and other nonviolent activists in the early 1960s. The Freedom Riders were leaders who left a legacy of activism for equality.
It's been a long